Hey everybody, welcome to Life is Brewtiful. I am Anthony. Today we're going to be talking about another semi-obscure beer style, one that's a little bit more overlooked than some of the more prominent ones, even in its genre. This one's coming out of Belgium in particular, and it is the sweet and sour Faro Lambic. If you've never heard of the Faro, I wouldn't blame you. It isn't as popular nowadays as it once was, but at one point in time, this was the quaffing drink of Brussels in Belgium. I mean, this was like the go-to beer style. And what makes it different than the other lambics is that although it is a mixed fermentation beer, it does have sour and funky notes. It is rather sweet, almost cloyingly so. The sweetness in Faro comes from extra sugars being added to batches of traditionally crafted lambic beers after they underwent mixed or spontaneous fermentation. Historically, the Faro would be allowed at least a year of fermentation before being selected to become Faro, usually due to some perceived off-taste or imperfection, which could then be covered by the added sweetness. Once selected, the brewers and blenders would typically cut the batch with other selected young lambics or non-funky second-running beers known as Miertsbier or Miersbier. This blending process would mellow out the intensity of the young lambics while also adding a fuller body and a slightly sweeter touch. Once shipped to taverns and pubs, the bar manager would further dilute the blend with a sugar source of his own choosing, such as candy sugar, molasses, honey, or anything else really. The sugar additives would then be muddled by a special tool designed for this process known as the Lambic Stomper, or in English, the Lambic Stomper. Finally, the concoction would be served to a thirsty patron, and it was known as Faro. But it had to be consumed quickly since the enzymes were still active and would begin consuming the newly added sugar, making it sour once again, and likely even more intense than how it started. Faro will usually be a little bit darker than your typical lambic. It'll be a little more fuller body because of all that excess unfermented sugar. Carbonation is going to be medium. You're going to have a sweet, wet finish in the mouthfeel instead of that harsh dryness and barren, toxic wasteland a normal lambic can turn your tongue into. Most Faros are going to range in between the 2.5 to 4.5, sometimes eking up to 5, average 3 ABV %. Okay, so getting into the history of the Faro. The earliest mention of Faro comes from a written account of a wild party in 1721. Interestingly, this mention predates the earliest mention of lambic, leading some to believe that Faro might have come first in regards to officially recognized beer styles. As confusing as that is, this theory suggests that beer soured and turned into what would now be considered lambic, but back then it was just considered an off beer, and it was too intense for the drinkers of Brussels, so they added sugar to make it more enjoyable and thus created Faro. Eventually, the Belgian beer drinkers' taste buds would evolve and they became adapted to the acidity of the lambic, making the more intense lambic a welcome addition. But really, this is just a theory. It is unknown who originally created it. It is unknown who the first brewer was, but all we really kind of know is that it just started popping up here and there, and it was greatly accepted into Belgian and Brussels beer drinking culture. But even stranger is the name Faro. Faro is not a word that originates in any of Belgium's main languages, which is French and Dutch. In fact, Faro is a more Latinized name, Spanish, and it is kind of odd that in the middle of Brussels they would name a beer after a Spanish name. So we kind of have to look at the geopolitical climate of that time. The name Faro may have stemmed from Spain's occupation of Brussels during the Habsburg reign of the Spanish Netherlands. At this point in time, Portugal and Spain had the same king and military obligations to maintain armed forces in their Central European properties. Reportedly, at this point in time, there were several contingents of Portuguese soldiers located in Brussels who are believed to have played a direct role in the development of the Faro. One theory suggests that the Faro as a style may have already existed. They might have already been taking subpar lambics and back sweetening them and releasing them to taverns for your daily drinking beer. And the theory suggests that when the Portuguese soldiers made it to Brussels and they started drinking this sweetened lambic, the acidity combined with the sweetness kind of reminded them of the dark, sweet, but tart wine back in their homeland of Faro. And they just kind of started either renaming it or drinking it so much that it became like colloquially named after these Portuguese soldiers from Faro. So that's one theory. The second theory suggests that the Faro actually did not exist prior to the Portuguese arriving in Brussels. But when they did get there, they were unable to handle the intensity, the brightness, the acidity of your typical lambic. So they started asking for sweetness to be added in, like behind the bar at the tavern, or they would add it themselves, creating a mellower, more easily drinking beer, which just became named after them, the Faro. But the main thing to take away is that no one really knows, and there may be some play from Spain and Portugal going into the overall history of the Faro, but no one really knows. Regardless, at this point in time, we started seeing it, and it had a name. So as I mentioned, the Faro was basically the quaffing beer of Brussels. It was cheap, it was affordable, it was low ABV, and it was the common purchase. Still to this day, if you go to certain lambic brewers or producers in Brussels and you order just a normal ordering of Faro, you are going to get a full-on liter. I mean, this is chugging beer. This was the equivalent of your Pilsners, of your export beers, of your Helles lagers. I mean, this was the chugger. And that might have been weird to some people at this time, especially people traveling into Brussels, non-locals, because they would have been sipping on Faro. They would have tasted all of like the weird off flavors, and then it was like garishly back sweetened behind the bar, creating like a non-harmonious, non-synergetic flavor. I mean, it's very easy to be confused as how the Faro became the beer of Brussels. In fact, there was actually a pretty interesting quote I stumbled across. The 19th century French poet Charles Baudelaire claimed, "Faro is the beer that you drink twice," because he assumed that it was brewed with the water that came out of the Seine River, which, I mean, possibly was, which at that time was also used as a sewer. So he was basically saying it tastes like fish because it was brewed using water, which may have been true. Regardless, the people of Brussels love Faro, and it was there to stay. It was insanely profitable for brewers because in the amount of time that it takes to brew lambic, sometimes 2, 3, 4 years, you could pump out a ton of Faros. If you're sitting there tasting it and you just don't think that the potential is there, bam, Faro, pump it out to the pubs. So this was the quick money maker, quick turnaround, quick profitability, where you let your special beers continue to age, develop, and mature. It was a win-win for the customer, the consumer, and the brewer. And that was pretty much the way things stayed until the 19th century, when the Faro started running into a little bit of a problem. In the 1850s, Belgium really opened itself up for welcoming in foreign imports of beer. Large amounts started coming in through Germany and across the channel from England. Problem was, a lot of their favorite beers, their local beers, started kind of getting pushed to the side. In particularly, the Faro was kind of ousted from its position as the main drinking beer by beautiful, bright, clear yellow lagers coming in from Bohemia and Bavaria. And then we also saw a ton of like ales, which the Belgians were rather accustomed to themselves coming in from England. But the local lambic producers were not going to go down without a fight. In fact, they started doubling down on the Faro even harder. And a lot of lambic brewers who didn't necessarily participate in Faro brewing beforehand, wanting to focus and, fine tune their craft of beautiful, well matured lambics, they started jumping in. So at that point in time, almost every lambic brewer and blender were all releasing Faros, trying to fight back against the imports. In fact, we have a lot of thanks to Boone, who almost based their entire brewing operation around Faro at this point in time in like the 1860s. They were like, this is the way to go. This is the fastest way to make a profit. Lambic, even though it's still going to be accepted by a subsect, the way that we're going to stay afloat in these harsh times is Faro production. Fast, quick, profitable. And it's because of them and their huge output of Faro that it kind of leveled the tides against the incoming imports. It kept Belgian beer Belgian. By the 1870s, the Pilsner had really come in force into Belgium, and a lot of the traditional beer styles got pushed to the fringes, and the Faro was unfortunately one of the hardest hit, as the Pilsner became the staple beer for Belgian pubs and taverns all the way up to the modern era, really. But with that said, the Faro would still hold a subsect of the market until World War I. But what oddly made the Faro nearly go extinct in World War I wasn't like the grain shortages or the bombing of infrastructure that we saw in a lot of other countries. What we actually saw was post World War I, people really started to adopt bottles instead of straight cask drinking at the taverns, and that was a huge decrease of people going to the taverns. Where Faro was sold in bulk amounts to the tavern, sweetened by the tavern owners, and then poured into the glasses, So if people weren't going there, instead buying bottles to take back to their home, and the Faro at that point in time specifically was not capable of being bottled. It was way too unstable, way too unpredictable. It wasn't going to happen. So the Faro fell even further out of the limelight. And it wouldn't really be until the 1970s when we started to see Faro come into a new era. Lambic brewers and blenders capitalized on an emerging consumer trend that sought out beers brewed in an artisanal and authentic style, making the Faro a prime frontrunner for this traditional revival. So that's where we started seeing a lot of the major Lambic brewers today releasing Faros, like Linderman's, Timmerman's, Boone, Cantillon. Almost all of them were producing Faro. And it still kind of stayed in that like middle ground between obscure and in the forefront of like the people who are in the know. Like I don't think talking about Faro Lambic to like people who are diehard Lambic fans is going to be too weird for them. They're going to be like, yeah, it's not obscure at all. But I think to a mass majority of beer drinkers, they would be kind of confused. And that's kind of the ground, the place where Faro has fit in for the past 50 years. And even still to this day, that 1970s heyday, that revival has kind of died out, with only very few Lambic producers still producing Faro in bottle format. I will say that the best chance you have of getting Faro in Belgium and Brussels right now are going to the actual brewers and blenders where you're able to order it in mass, in bulk, because I just don't think many of them are willing to put it into a bottle and lose the money on packaging and everything when it's supposed to be just a cheap go-to beer. However, the concept of Faro as a legitimate beer style has actually come under attack in recent decades. Following the World Wars, the rise of soda as the go-to drink amongst consumers actually threatened the brewing industry across the globe. And in an attempt to compete, Lambic brewers started producing something known as sweet Lambic, which was a pasteurized Lambic that was back-sweetened with sugars and fruits. Hey, editing Anthony here real quick. So when I was talking about the soda part, I never really tasted a Faro that I thought would be comparable to soda. So, I included it because of like the history aspect of it and everything, but I was just like, that's kind of like a throwaway statement or whatever. And then I actually tried this Faro in particular, which belongs to Boone. It is the Boone Faro. And oh my God. It tasted just like a soda, for real. I actually had to run upstairs, wake my wife up because she was in bed. I was like, you have to taste this because I don't know if I'm just like going crazy, but it it did kind of, I could see it being a competitor against soda.
Okay, I think you could taste like a very flat, off-brand diet, zero sugar, zero everything, Coke, Pepsi.
It still had a little bit of an acidity to it, but I mean, I'd say it's comparable. It's comparable. The most famous producers of sweet lambic is without a doubt Linderman's, whose lambic beers are actually more comparable to other lambic producers' Faro beers. These sweet lambics created this weird dichotomy in the overall lambic and Faro beerscape where it further obfuscated where the lines are in the lambic family of beer styles. But with that being said, you could argue, on the other hand, that the Faro is now more popular than it has ever been since World War I, thanks to the sweet lambic brewers like Linderman's, which I haven't had their Faro yet, but kind of nervous. If their normal beers are sweet, I can't imagine how sweet that one's going to be. Regardless, the Faro is incredibly overlooked as a beer style. It might not be the most well-defined. It might be a little confusing to some drinkers, and there's probably a ton of people who don't like it. Too sour for the non-beer drinkers, too sweet for the sour drinkers. It is just this weird middle ground. But I think that's what makes it so interesting. It is a beer style defined by its history, by its technique, and by an adjunct, essentially. It's just this weird little oddball, and that makes me love it. It makes me root for it even harder. Anyways, thanks for watching, everybody. I really hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something about this little beloved beer style of mine, the Faro Lambic. It is just so weird and so odd that it just makes me want to root for it and wish it the best. So give it a try. If you've never had a Lambic, if you've been too scared to try like the huge intensity of it, Faro might be up your alley. So give it a try. Let me know what you think. Like, comment, subscribe. Remember, there's a story in every bottle. That life is beautiful. Cheers.